die scharfe Mehrzeit nachher. Genau. Okay then, so let's come to the second part of the lecture, where we are now focusing on the maybe most important example that we are currently discussing when we are discussing questions of sustainability, namely the case of climate change. And I will give at this part of the lecture a certain normative focus on the issue of climate change, namely the focus of justice. And well, very quickly, you are all very familiar with the problem of climate change, but what I think is always important to highlight when we are talking about protecting the climate system or the environment is that in a way, climate system protection, of course, is primarily protection of human lives, of human rights, the environments and other things. It's not the climate system itself that is in any way in need of protection in the sense of it is an entity that has its own value, etc. We are protecting the climate system because we want to protect the living conditions of humanity, of other animals, and so on. So I think this is very important to for somehow framing the idea of climate system protection. So we all know the problems climate change fosters, the natural disasters with all their serious consequences for human beings, droughts, crop failures, and all the problems that go with it, the scarcity of water that is the cause of growing violent conflicts, of wars in some parts of the world already, and all the political and social issues that come with climate change, displaced persons, and up to the level of failed states, where many people working in the political and social science are quite sure that these problems will accelerate in a dramatic scale within the next decades. So the ethical problem, I think, is all well known. Once again, before we are looking at this problem in more detail, I have another slide with some basic remarks to the field of ethics. We are talking in the field of climate change often about rights individuals possess and rights that should be protected. For example, we say climate change violates the rights of future generations to a healthy environment, to a livable environment, or climate change violates the rights of people living in the global south with regard to their basic rights. And I wanted to introduce this slide to somehow explain a bit how this normativity of rights is working. Because when we are using the term right, the central idea is always that individuals are at the center. Individuals are the ones that possess rights. Individuals are the primary subjects of rights and therefore of justice. Collectives and groups only come into the picture as in a way that is derivative. So a person's right can be violated because they belong to a certain group, for example, to a religious group or to a group with a certain gender identity and so on. But collectives and groups are only interested within a theory of rights because they might determine how the rights of individual persons are protected or not. Now, what is very important and what makes the issue of rights so complicated is that rights normally are understood within philosophy as justified entitlements. If a person P has a right to X, to gain a certain resource, to behave in a certain way, there are good reasons that P is entitled to X. And why is this problematic? Because entitlement means that there is someone else who has a corresponding duty. So if P has a right to X, there is some other person R or some other institution R that is obliged to provide X or not to interfere with X. And I think at this point you can already see where the problems are. If we are claiming that climate change is violating certain persons' rights, we always have the question in front of us, who is the one that is responsible to secure this right? Who is the one that needs to act, that has to act? So when we talk about rights, we always need to ask the question about duties. Which kind of duties are there? Who has these duties? Now, let us look at climate change in more detail. In the context of climate change, we normally talk about three groups of persons who are mostly negatively affected by climate change, namely on the one side, poor people in the global north, in countries wealthy like Germany or the United States, then many people in fact, the majority of the population in the global south, and future generations. These are normally the groups we are looking at when we are talking about justice in the context of climate change. General, empirically, it holds that the problem is dramatic because those people who contribute a lot to climate change most probably belong at the same time to groups that are less affected by climate change's consequences. So we have here a strong asymmetry between people contributing to climate change and those people who are negatively affected, which makes, in a typical justice framework, things much more worse. So, what I'm now trying to present to you is, so that you get an idea of what we are doing in climate ethics, some theoretical issues that come with climate change and that are very tricky in themselves, and I later come to practical consequences of these issues. So here's a quote, and you find this quote in many ways, and I think it's a quite nice illustration. It's from the philosopher John Nelson, who asked, "Why should I do anything for posterity? What has posterity ever done for me?" The main idea of asking this is to say, well, justice between generations, as it is important for climate change, is in a way a quite complicated system and a quite complicated idea, because some traditional ideas of justice that we have don't work between different generations. So one classical idea of justice is to say we are living in a society that is structured in the same way by cooperation and by competition. So we are living in a society, we want certain things, other people are around who want certain things as well. And then we in a way have to coordinate the whole thing. And this is the point where justice comes into play. This is a traditional conception. However, that does not work when it comes to future generations. We do not cooperate with future generations in a meaningful sense. We will all be gone when they are there and confronted with the situation we left to them. So in a way, this is a totally different problem. A second point related to this. Many philosophers try to conceptualize justice in a way of a fair contract. So the idea is, basically speaking, we can think about a contract that we all together sign, agreeing on certain rules we want to follow to live in peace and wealthy together. So this is the idea of a contract. However, once again, this contract model does not work with regard to future persons who will never be in any meaningful way partners with whom we can sign a contract. Another, even more complicated problem: what does it mean to claim a right for a person that does not yet exist? What kind of right should this be? How can we conceptualize such a right for a non-existing entity? These are quite tricky issues for climate ethics. And just to give, and I promise it's only one side, to give an example of the weird kind of examples we like to discuss in philosophy to illustrate and illuminate this problem. It's a very famous problem by the philosopher Derek Parfit in his 1980s book, Reasons and Persons. So Parfit starts from a very simple starting point. If any particular person had not been conceived when he was in fact conceived, it is in fact true that he would never have existed. Very simple. Our personal identity in a way depends on the moment of our conception, because then important parts of our identity are in a way pre-programmed for the whole life course. So, and now Parfit goes on to say, if we look at two possible worlds. One world, the world where we are able to solve the climate crisis and where we surely can handle the problem, and another world where climate crisis is maybe out of control or is sharpening dramatically. Then he said, well, these two worlds are very different with regard to all that happens within this world. So it is very probable that in these different worlds, different people meet at different times, falling in love with other different people, getting different children, and so on. What is the consequence of this? The consequence of this is that person who live in the world seriously hurt by climate change cannot, that's Parfit's claim, possibly complain about their lot, because in the other world where climate change problems are solved, they would never have existed. These worlds would take a totally different course of events and actions, there would exist other people. And there are a lot of answers to this. I simply wanted to present this, I think, fascinating theoretic example to make clear that there are a lot of conceptual issues at play here when it comes to the rights of persons that are not yet born, and the rights of persons that live in the future and whose identity is not clear at the moment. So if we assume for a moment that we can solve all these fancy issues, then we can look at theories of justice and ask the question, what would be a just solution, a just dealing with the climate crisis and with its problems? Justice is one of the most central concepts of philosophy since antiquity, starting with Plato and Aristotle in the Western world, with authors like Confucius in the Chinese world. So it's a very old idea. And there are lots of different theories of justice. I only wanted to highlight here two different types of theories that we have in the field. On the one side, we have outcome-oriented theories, as they are normally called. And here is the idea that we can describe certain states of affairs, certain distributions of good that are just. So, for example, this can be a state where we have equality of rights, goods, capabilities, or chances. This can be a state where we have a maximization of utility, whatever exactly utility is. This can be a world where we have a secured basic standard for everyone. So very different ideas, but they all share the central thought that justice is an issue of outcomes of certain distributions that exist in the world. On the other hand, we have theories that are, in a way, procedure-oriented. This means we are not looking at the outcomes, but we are looking at the question of the distribution process. Was this a fair process? Was this a process in which all people had a fair chance to get certain things? So it is not that important how the outcome is. What is decisive is the procedure. And based on this, we can look at special conceptions of climate justice. And I brought here only three to keep it a bit in limits. Well, maybe the most important one is what we call egalitarianism in the field, and this is the claim that we find a just solution to the climate crisis if future generations are at least as well off as we. A couple of problems that come with it directly. The first is, who is this we in such a claim? It seems intuitive, plausible to say, well, our children should be just as good off as we are, but who is this we exactly? Is this we, for example, an average citizen of a Western wealthy state? Might be a plausible claim, but what, for example, is with people who already live in poverty, sometimes in severe poverty? Does this conception make sense in such a situation? The other thing is, how can we justify such a claim to say, well, what we have to do is to leave a world that is as good as we received it? Well, one could say we in a way had some big advantages because our parents did the same. This is one very important argument in the field to say, well, we received certain benefits from the past. We are not really able to pay the past back because this is not the way how things work. So somehow we can pay our debts of the past in the way that we give certain things to the future. So this might be a way to defend this idea that future generations should be as well off as we are. Another conception, very important in the field, is utilitarianism. And there the main idea is we have a just solution to the problem of climate change if we maximize utility. First of all, one can make a long discussion about what exactly utility is. The classic answers are normally two within ethics. On the one side, one can understand utility as pleasure and pain, so amounts of pleasure and pain that certain people experience. On the other side, one can understand utility as desire fulfillment, so the amount of personal desires that got fulfilled or that got frustrated. So if we have such an idea, and some authors in the field are quite decisive on it, this might result in practice in the point that we really need to stop climate change as soon as possible, maybe even at the highest cost. And what is the argument beyond this? The best is yet to come. Most human beings that will ever live as long as the Earth exists and as long as we don't assume that we have an early catastrophe due to a collapse of the whole world society and so on, then it is most probable that the majority of all human beings that ever live on Earth will live in the future, that we are only starting, that we are still in the first 10 to 12%, whatever, of all the human beings that will ever live on the Earth. And then, if this is true, and if our goal is maximize utility, then definitely what we have to do is to stop the problem as soon as possible. And if the costs are very high for us, well, it's maybe tragic, but this is the way it is. So utilitarians are quite strict on this to say, we should maximize utility, and it might be the case, quite probably, that this means that we must restrict our lifestyle in very strict ways to keep resources, to enable better lives in the future. A third view, and I personally have quite big sympathies for this view, and there are quite a lot of people defending this view, is what we call in the debate sufficientarianism. Sufficient is the word inside, and there you already have the basic idea, namely our primary obligation is to secure that future people should be sufficiently well off. They should have enough. And this is the duty that we need to fulfill, and we need to stop climate change in ways that we can justifiably say, well, future people will have enough. And then, of course, the question is, what exactly is enough, and how can we specify this enough? And then one general answer, and I think a quite plausible answer, is to look at human rights and to say, well, enough is a situation in which the basic human rights of all people can be secured. And these rights include not only civic and political rights, but as well later generations of human rights like social rights and environmental rights. And then you see the idea gets quite soon quite complicated as well. So there are quite strong and very broad things we need to do in order to fulfill this sufficientarianism and the sufficientarist rule. So how can we justify this? How can we say, well, we should leave enough for later people? One famous argument is to say, well, we do not exactly know how the world will look like in 100 years. We all see, for example, the developments within artificial intelligence. It's so quick, and we maybe don't have even an idea what might be possible in 5 years or in 10 years with regard to techniques. So it is really impossible to give an exact picture of what people might need in 100 years. But what we do know is that as long as people belong to our species, are Homo sapiens sapiens, they will need certain things and live a life of a certain shape, because this somehow is tied to the species. They will need, for example, access to water, they will need nourishment, they will need places to live, and so on. So this might be a strategy to justify this idea of enough and say, well, we can orientate ourselves with regard to human rights, and on this foundation we can clarify what exactly is enough. So, if we have once settled these issues of principles of justice within climate change, we can ask another question, namely, who exactly is responsible for securing these rights? Who should somehow, in a way, pay the bill? Who are the primary actors in the field that need to fulfill these duties of justice? Then we are looking here at the global situations and asking which different states do possess which kind of responsibility. And I have put on this slide 2 of the leading principles that are in discussion to somehow distribute responsibility for climate protection on a global scale. The first is maybe very intuitively plausible, the principle of causation, to say the extent of responsibility depends on the extent of causation. So a state's or a state's duties to reduce emissions and to pay for adaptation measures is depending on the extent this state contributed to the whole problem. This is a principle that is broadly accepted within climate ethics. A second, maybe more problematic principle is to say, well, the wealthy states that are able to help and that are able to pay for adaptation measurements, that are able to reduce their emissions, they are responsible, even if they not to a higher degree caused the problem. So this might be, maybe most of us share the idea that if someone causes a certain damage, they are responsible for paying for it, to repair it. But the second principle of capability might be more under discussion. What is the intuition behind it? The intuition is very simple to say this is a kind of emergency situation, the climate crisis. And in an emergency situation, the question is not, did someone cause a problem, but are they able to help? So take the classic example of a child that is somehow falling into a lake and you are simply passing by because you take your daily walk with the dog. You are in this case, of course, morally responsible to get the child out of the lake. It doesn't matter whether you contributed or caused the problem or not. This is simply not the question. There is a clear moral duty to help. And some people say, well, and this is exactly the situation with regard to climate crisis. It is a kind of global catastrophe, and so it does not really matter whether certain states contributed or to which extent they contributed. What matters is, are they able to help or not? With regard to the empirical part of it, one could say, well, it does not really matter that much whether you choose the first or the second principle. However, this might be still true at this point in time, where those states that are the most wealthiest ones still contribute decisively to the problem. But there are quite some predictions to say, well, these two principles might differ more in the future to come. So take, for example, the Northern European states who are in comparison with many other states, quite well on the way to reducing emissions and at the same time very wealthy. So in a couple of years, it might be the case that one can claim, well, they are responsible to, for example, help poorer states due to the principle of capability and not any longer due to the principle of causation. So these are two basic principles in the field. Maybe one further point, this sounds pretty easy, but if you want to do a political practice on base of this, you soon get quite a lot of problems. To mention only one point, namely production chains. So if a certain toy, for example, is produced in China, maybe even some resources are imported, and then it is bought here as a Christmas present, and some German children use it. How do you contribute the emissions in this process? Who is responsible for the emissions of the production? Are they part of a Chinese budget? Are they part of a German budget? Are they part somehow of a split budget that belongs to both countries? So there are a lot of practical questions if you're working with one of these principles. Okay, so we are soon at the end of this second part of the lecture, but one point that I think is very decisive, especially if we are focusing here on a technological university and aspects of technology, namely the question, should we be, with regard to the whole problem, optimists or should we be pessimists? So, for example, just one question that somehow illustrates this difference. How much adaptation is needed, which kinds of adaptations are morally permissible? Should we, for example, be very optimistic with regard to geoengineering and say, well, we can somehow trust that we find some technological solutions for the problems, or should we rather be pessimists? So to illustrate these two possible positions, take somehow these idealized positions here. We have an optimist who says, well, when we look at climate models, we should focus on those scenarios that possess the highest possibility. And then we should look how can we deal with these scenarios. And one important part of the answer, how we should deal with it, might be we should trust technology, that we find certain ways, for example, of geoengineering to solve the problem, to handle the problem, to find an adequate solution. The pessimist, on the other side, says we should not focus, when we are looking at climate models, on the scenarios with the highest possibility, but we should focus on those scenarios that are most catastrophic. And we should ask, what do we have to do to make sure that these scenarios will never become reality? And often what is part of this is a mistrust in the promise of technology. You find within ethics both sides, and as I believe that this might be quite an interesting topic here, I decided to present here only one example, very famous example for a pessimist view on this. This is the German Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas, who already 40 years ago wrote a very famous book, The Principle of Responsibility. And in the last years, Jonas really had a little renaissance. You can find him often quoted in the public debate as well. And Jonas has a concept that is called the heuristics of fear. What is the basic idea? If we are facing situations with great uncertainty and with high moral stakes, we should be pessimists, so to say, from a methodological point of view. We should be pessimists and avoid any further risk. And surely the climate crisis is an instance of such a situation with high moral stakes and great uncertainty. What does this mean in consequence? In such situations, Jonas claims, the bad prognosis has priority over the good prognosis, regardless of certain percentages that you can add to different scenarios of probabilities. You simply have to look what is the bad prognosis, and everything then needs to be done to prevent these worst case scenarios. So you have to make absolutely clear and absolutely sure that this scenario will never become reality. And this kind of thinking framework Jonas calls the heuristic of fear, and he explicitly says in such situations we should not have hope that things will turn out well, but we should really fear on an emotional level as well that things might turn out worse and even catastrophically, because if we have this fear, if we are afraid of these catastrophic scenarios, we in a way, so Jonas says, realize what really is at stake, and we as well learn something about our values, why we are doing the whole thing, why we are trying to avoid an acceleration of climate crisis. Yeah, and I think here we stop. And should maybe make some questions, if there are any, and then we can have a short break before the scenario, I'd say.
Sounds good.